Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk on behalf of Let's Build, Let's Really Talk, Modernising the Built Environment. My name is Tyler Ibanja, and I'm here with my co-chair, Shaynesia Byfield, and we will be chairing, and we have some amazing speakers. Eugene, if you could go to the next slide. Just again, welcome to today's event. Let's really talk modernising the built environment. Here with me, I have some amazing speakers, practitioners, architects, and construction workers, all members of the built environment. And we're really gonna dissect, discuss, and debate some very important topics right now. And we are very happy that you guys can join us for this. So Eugene, next slide. So yes, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. My name is Tyler Ibanja. I am 21 years old and I have just graduated from the Bartlett, and I am now in Sweden doing a year of further study in architecture and urban design. So that's quite nice. And I guess really when I kind of pitched this talk and talking about modernizing, I guess I wanted to look at modern as a way kind of breaking that word down, and how that is actually kind of a Western point of view, in my opinion, when we say modern, Eurocentric point of view, especially in this very complex urban environment, especially in London, where we have a multitude of cultures and ethnicities, that using something like modern is actually can be quite reductive. So I guess talking, that's kind of the approach in which I'd like to start. And I will hand over to my other chair, Shaynesia. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shaynesia Byfield, and I am a project manager at Homes for Haringey. I am a former quantity surveyor, and I actually came into the construction industry as a biology graduate, completely nervous, not understanding what the hell was expected of me. Going onto construction sites and being completely confused and thinking, oh my God, what is this? But I can wholeheartedly say today, I'm proud to be within the industry. However, we still do have our teething problems. We have a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And in regards to modernising the built environment, we need a complete overhaul. We need to change how we need to build. We need to build differently. We have existing stock. What are we doing to improve that existing stock that we have in London, in the world that we live in all of the cities in the UK? So again, with Tyler, thank you very much for attending our talk today. And we look forward to having a very engaging discussion with you all.
Eugene, next slide, please. Yeah, and now we'll hand over to our amazing speakers today. So Sean, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Sean Adams. So I graduated from a master's degree last year. So I'm an architectural designer. I also write about architecture. I currently teach BA architecture at Central St. Martin's. And I'm a co-founder of a social enterprise called Poor Collective, which stands for Power Out of Restriction. And we work with young people to really empower them and give them opportunities to craft parts of the built environment. I think when we're just speaking about modern, for me, I would say modern means kind of focusing on the present, but simultaneously reflecting on the past and looking towards the future in every sense. And that could be from the built environment in terms of physical form, but also in terms of who gets a say in the built environment.
Thank you very much. Next slide. Marwa, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for this invitation. My name is Marwa, and I'm one part of a collective called After Party. And we're interested in sort of exploring the city and the cultural and civic aspects of the city through the lens of identity and race. And I guess when I was thinking about the theme for this talk about modernizing the built environment, I mean, I'm an architect and I'm a writer as well, and I also teach at Kingston. So I see like the different facets of how architecture comes into being from the point of view of critiquing it through writing, but also being part of it through building, and then teaching it to the next sort of generation. And I think of modernizing as sort of almost like bringing architecture to speed with the values of society today, which I think there's a lack of there's a disconnect in the relationship between what people value and then what we see mainstream modern architecture as sort of propagating in terms of standardization and how things are just whacked into place with no sort of soul or connection to anything. And I think for me, modernizing is kind of, we need to build in a way that mirrors our values rather than just kind of in this repetitive, a kind of mindless way, I think. So that's how I think of it.
Thank you. And we have Zine next. Zine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name's Zine McFarlane. I have a small architecture practice called Zine McFarlane Architecture Studio. And we basically specialize in kind of affordable housing, but kind of with a new spin on that. And to kind of justify or kind of describe modern to me, I probably lost a few people with this one, but for me, kind of, I couldn't talk about modern architecture or like the built environment in a modern way without actually observing how our lifestyles have changed. So I think when people think of modern architecture, they probably think of like a Mies van der Rohe building or something simplistic, minimalist. And for me, kind of modern lifestyles go hand in hand. And just think about how much our lifestyles have changed, like being digital nomads, co-working spaces. We often find that buildings nowadays, we have traditional buildings and we have co-working spaces that are thrown into these buildings instead of actually going, wait a minute, our whole way of living has changed. When do we start actually designing for that, opposed to working traditionally and trying to squeeze our modern lifestyle into the existing fabric?
Thank you. The next slide, please. And then we have Herman. Herman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well. Yes, I'm Herman Morgan. I'm the director and architect or co-director and architect for a design practice called MAD, which we started over 10 years ago now. Our practice, it basically, we specialize in master planning, urbanism and architecture. We're based out of London and the Caribbean. And we're a practice that is expanding into the development sectors as well, mainly hospitality and tourism. And that's after we founded the practice, that's after working for a number of architects within London, namely AJ Associates and Arup, Grimshaw and Populous. So we kind of grounded our practice after working for those particular practices with the idea of sort of giving an idea of our take on master planning, urbanism, etc. And I think that the idea of modernizing the built environment is quite a hefty subject, because as I said in my piece, and as you as grown as architects and looking at different narratives along the way from many different architects and cultivating your own, you come to start thinking, and other practitioners that are from the same background as I am, which is African Caribbean. the idea of modernity starts to get questioned. What is modernity? Where, you know, there are the different types of modernity, and how do you cultivate the type of modernity that's reflective of the cultures that are within, you know, culture, you know, Afro-Caribbean culture in particular, and African culture. How do you do that? And that's where we are. We're trying to sort of create this new sense of direction, and trying to get a real understanding, because that process in itself is not easy, because you have to unpick a lot and then try and inject your own, and just articulating that in our architecture and in the design, in the urban environment. That's where I'm interested. So we've been doing that for a while, and that's us.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So yes, this takes us on to our discussion points. We've got a couple of them lined up for our talk for today. So the first discussion point: at its current state, architecture and the construction industry are professions meant for upholding the elites that have the capacity to shape urban environments rather than designing for those on the ground.
So I think we will kick off. Herman, do you want to start this discussion? And then we can all jump in and chime in as we go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tyler. I think with this this point of discussion, I think more often than not, it's the position that I think professionals ours, such as ours, and similar construction professionals find ourselves in within the delivery hierarchy that places us kind of I want to say the mercy of elites, let's say, who tend to be the decision makers in shaping urban strategies and environments. And I think working alongside decision makers at the earliest possible time, and aspiring to actually be a decision maker and sit at those tables, is crucial. I think whether you're starting out in your career, there should be that aspiration and that sort of drive to do that. Otherwise, we're constantly going to be trying to be at the table, which is a difficult process in itself. I think architects in particular have an enormous skill set, I think, to develop narratives and articulate the need of those on the ground. I think that's quite crucial within the urban environment. So that's my opening statement on that.
Thank you. And I guess sort of for me, I guess I'd like to ask as well, in terms of this point, is that what I want to ask is, and I'll put this to everyone as well, and please just chime in, but I think for me, what this kind of statement says is that there's something wrong with the system, and that the system itself needs an overhaul, rather than, you know, that it's all very well and good saying we need to design better, we need to blah, blah, blah. But actually it's the system, because as you know, Herman, you've said, we architects aren't the ones making the decisions. You know, we're not the ones making the decisions. And yes, we're taught to construct a narrative, but that's what we're doing. We're constructing a narrative, something that has the capacity not even to be real in that sense. I guess, Sean, you're nodding a lot. So I think, do you have anything to say here?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with some of the points that Herman raised. I think what's interesting about this quote is when you think about if we were to kind of call a spade and be quite frank and speak about who are those people on the ground, I think a lot of the time that's communities that are marginalized and are often kind of neglected when we speak about architecture. I think what was interesting was Ian was talking a little bit about housing before, and I think we can definitely bring this back to housing, because if you think about the architects and designers of kind of most of the buildings in our city, what people are kind of attracted to are the kind of egotistical, bombastic buildings that are a statement, but then the kind of the social housing and some of the kind of most neglected spaces in our society seem to be something that the elites aren't interested in, and we keep kind of seeing the struggles, whether it's on the news or in the kind of newspapers, of people living in terrible housing conditions, or just conditions across London and the UK. But then we kind of see at the same time proposals for a tulip-shaped building that will kind of soar up into the skies of London. So there's almost this weird kind of that dichotomy between the most kind of marginalized communities and those that are at the kind of forefront, quote unquote, of society.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree there. I mean, housing is a right. Every single person deserves to live in adequate, brilliant, good housing. It's horrible because we've just all experienced a pandemic. And when you just look at the people who work within certain roles, you know, who are the people that are in certain roles on the front lines, right? Then you look at housing, and then you look at the people that live in squalid conditions. It's terrible. But I think off the back of that, you've also got to consider what these boards look like. You know, if you've got a whole housing association, why does the board not represent directly the communities in which we are serving? Why do we not have people on the boards who have worked, lived in certain areas that do need to be redeveloped? That is something that needs to be honed in. And I'm not talking about, you know, we've had a whole Black Lives Matter, off the back of Black Lives Matter, oh, we're going to do more to actually engage and try and sought after people who are Black, ethnic minorities to get onto these boards. No, we're not doing that just because that's happened. That should be the normal anyway. So I think there's that type of situation to play into here as well.
Yeah, I believe the narrative of the family is a big aspect of building. You know, because of COVID, a lot of people have experienced living at home for longer and isolation, and maybe some people, there seems like maybe there's more people that are finding the home more comfortable to live, but then there could be more difficulties within the home, but like deprivation and for those that are having difficulty with like reconstruction at homes that do need to be redeveloped in certain areas.
Definitely agree, Stephanie. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any closing points for this?
I could go on for ages about this. You'd have to stop me. I think, especially with what Sean mentioned about communities, and when I hear about community, because especially working in London on many different projects where you have huge sort of huge developments where it's infrastructure, you know, mixed use development, as well as the urban environment. A lot of the communities, especially housing, they get forgotten. And I guess, you know, there's a lot of factors to consider, especially with the decision makers, and how they deliver. They're putting money in, let's just be blunt, and they're actually paying for these environments to be constructed, built, etc. But I think it's obviously our position to obviously, you know, integrate a little bit of a better and more considered approach to those who are actually going to be the users. But that I think that spectrum of sectors and uses is where we come into our own, and I think that's why I keep reiterating the point of being alongside the decision makers, because when you're in those rooms, and I've been in a lot of them, where you do have the decision makers and you do have the architects however experienced and however, prominent, there is still that, well, you just need to do what we say. And then how do you bridge the gap where you say, okay, you know what, we really need to tackle this issue of, social housing, the quota of social housing within a particular development, that tends to get squashed down, the percentages get squashed down, and it's purely a lot of the time because of finance and return. So it's maybe it's finding the right developer, finding the right I guess legislation and planning reform to adopt a wider and more appropriate approach that does have more a considered approach to those designing on the ground. Well, not to go on, but when I was really quick anecdote. When I was a part two doing, we were doing the London Olympics as a project, yeah, and I was brought into Populous to help with the actual London 2012 master plan, and I actually brought in some of the studies that I brought, which were about community, and I was surprised I actually got listened to by some of the people within the room that were talking about, how are we gonna do the legacy portion of the London 2012 Olympics, because the communities are going to be affected. So it's that level of integration, I think, that's needed long term, not just a short term sort of view. It's a long term strategy that involving architects and the industry, the wider industry. Sorry, no need to go on here.
Okay, thank you. And Zena, Marwa, I know you guys had unmuted at one point.
It's all right. I can hop into. Go on, Marwa. Go for it. I'll hop into the next one.
My point is just very quick. I was listening to what everyone was saying, and I'm thinking, if architecture and construction industry are sort of tools for economic growth in this country, what do people think realistically is the sort of role of architects within that? Because I'm hearing everyone talk about community and sort of this bottom-up representation, which I think is really important, but sometimes it feels like a bigger problem than that, because when I compare it to other models in other, say, European countries, I guess we get compared to Belgium and these kinds of places quite a lot, I can see that they're prioritizing the interests of actual people through legislation and things that they introduce, through how they control the construction industry. And there's no amount of, I think bottom-up kind of activism is really important, but I do think you need the support of, the people on top as well. And I don't see our government doing that. And I think that's fundamentally the problem that we have in this country, is that their interests are just not aligned with the people at the bottom. And as long as that continues, it's just not we're never going to get what we want out of it, so to speak. So that's kind of all I wanted to add.
It definitely feels like we're not on the same hymn sheet. Some people are more of the lines of, no, we need to build more new, even though we don't really have as much brownfield space. Or some are like, no, well, we'll just have to keep existing on top of what we're doing. Okay, but with our stock that we have now, we've got to achieve zero carbon. What are we really doing to really do that? So it's all of these different ideas that we have. We're not really in the same rooms. The people who need to be here are not there. It's just all over the place. And that's what I mean in terms we're all just in silos. We're just independently, whatever our line of business is, we're a developer, we need to do this. We're a client, we need to do this. We're a contractor, we need to do this. We need to stop having all of these outside conversations, bring ourselves together and actually collaborate, because the more collaboration, the more productive we are, the better that the economy can be. At the end of the day, the construction industry pumps so much into that. So why are we not really working with that to our best advantage?
I guess on that point as well, I would say because now I'm living in Sweden for now, and I think the approach here as well is much different, very different to the approach in England, what I've seen kind of architecturally, especially in the way, in sort of the the amount of transparency there is between those on the ground, decision makers, architects, etc. Because or when there isn't that transparency, there is a very big uproar. And where I am, I'm in a bit of a smaller community anyway, but there really is that kind of, you can kind of see the hierarchies of decisions, and you can chime in and give your voice, which I don't think England has, from in my experience, to be honest. And I think transparency and communities being able to have the agency as well to discuss and speak up is another thing, especially when you have industries like architecture where, you know, it's considered a language and it's considered an artistic vocation that only a select few can know. You know, look at how our education's set up. It's set up in a way that it filters out. So, you know, I think there's that kind of that dichotomy there, that, you know, there's no transparency in England, which means that it's not as accessible, and then there's hierarchies, and our built environment is not built for people that is actually living there, I would say.
Yeah, I know what you mean, Taylor. Because like our buildings do communicate with each other. They have behaviors and behavior changes, and it's all about the build and construction at the end of the day, and that's the designers and the team of architects that put it together. You know, because there is like universities that have numbers on each rooms, but then there is hospitals that also have rooms that have numbered, and they have doors with merges, and within the COVID changes, that everything is becoming digital, you know, so it'll be like biometrics to enter and for our identification to our COVID vaccines to be sort of like linked up to prove that we have been vaccinated, you know, so the changes in society are happening, but is it for the best? That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, I think we're going to go on to our next discussion point. Maybe Eugene, you can share the screen on that slide so we can all see. Yeah, so our next discussion point is, with the ARB proposing for a systems overhaul of the architecture industry, what do we want to see? And at the end, is it actually that, is it worth it? Marwa, maybe we start with you, or, and then we can just chime in again. Thanks, Eugene. You can stop sharing now as well. Thank you.
I could start, but I would say I don't quite know what the ARB are proposing in terms of an overhaul. I've heard of sort of them wanting to restructure maybe how people register, or opening it up a bit, which I think is good. But I don't think I know the ins and outs of exactly what they're proposing. I mean, I would say that obviously it's been much talked about how much change the ARB need, and particularly just the whole qualification, people doing it for the sake of doing it and not leading to anything afterwards, and it just being kind of a means to an end. And I think, well, I would maybe go a bit further to say that like the profession could definitely do with people embracing a bit more adjacencies around just the subject of architecture. As in, I think the definition of architect is sort of something, I mean, sometimes I think about it from a sustainability point of view, and I think maybe in years to come, we're not going to be building as much. And so therefore, what is the role of the architect even going to be at that point? Because we're going to think about reuse and all these other ways of engaging. And so already I think the rise of, you know, collectives and different people engaging with architecture in different ways is already expressing a sort of desire to move away from this kind of autonomy of like building buildings, but maybe engaging in different ways, or maybe getting on these decision-making boards, or being involved in legislation, like some people have said. And I think that's really important, because I think it's really strange, but when you teach architecture, you talk about so many different subjects, but at the end of how it's practiced and how it works, it tends to be that architects just kind of work with other architects, and there isn't really any, although people will say, it's interdisciplinary and so on, it rarely ever is truly interdisciplinary. Like, I mean, I don't think like working with M&E consultants and so on counts as interdisciplinary. They're the kind of people you have to work with to get things built. But I think it could benefit definitely from the opinion of adjacent qualifications. And I know even from being an after party and us having a variety of people, we've got architects, we've got people studying history and theory, we've got spatial practice, kind of interdisciplinary studies, like a wide range of interests. And it really helps our conversations in terms of, like things that you would assume somebody else would very quickly point out that isn't what it needs to be or how it has to be. And I think it can definitely benefit from that. So I think the reform is definitely welcome. It's just how they go about it. Because, I think like going back to kind of the city and the city reflecting people's values, it just, if you have a city full of kind of diverse inhabitants and kind of layers of how people live and engage and so on, it makes sense that the people involved in kind of shaping the outcome of that also come from different walks of life, not just from a diversity or ethnic diversity point of view, but also from a discipline point of view. Like they have variety of range, you need psychologists, I think, and kind of spatial awareness, and as well as people who can build buildings. But I do think you need a wider host of activities. And also, I just question how much building we'll be doing in future, and what is the architect going to be in 50 years time or 100 years time. There's already people taking stances of sort of going down routes of reuse and kind of conservation, all these other points. And so I think it's quite exciting though. So I hope that they do something good with it. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. I know for me, when I kind of saw that the ARB was sending out loads of reports and questions and surveys about changing, pathways for one aspect that they were looking at and diversifying architecture in that way, I was quite shocked actually, because I think these conversations about architecture and being very, not very diverse has been happening for 20 or 30 odd years. So, I was quite shocked that this was kind of happening now. But I was also kind of thinking that with these changes, I think it like you said, what even is the architect now? Because we're not going to be building as much, and there's so much decisions involved, and architects have lost so much control over the past 20, not even 20, 100 years, and so what does that mean now in this kind of complex environment as well? I can't answer that question, but I guess that those are kind of stances that I kind of moments that kind of pop out with me. I don't really.
I think if I could just comment on that point. I feel the ARB needs to get. I'm hoping that they would have more integration with REBA, where they are a lot more close knit, because it almost, from my experience, it feels like you follow the REBA process within your part 1 to 3 or 1 to 2 education. And then when you get to the wider world, you then find out a little bit more about the ARB. And then when it comes to professional accreditation and experience, it's the ARB. And then it starts to become more about the ARB for me than anything else, because the issues of practicing as an architect, it brings it into sharp focus, especially when you're working obviously professionally, and there's a lot of liability issues and professional insurances and things like that. So I feel like as early as possible, if especially within the education process, there's a lot more emphasis on the ARB as early as possible, and what it means to be what it means to be an architect, because you're obviously on the road to becoming an architect. So, you know, how do you perform that role within the wider context of the built environment and the legals involved in that? I felt like, you know, it was, you know, a great part 1 and part 2, and design experience, but when it came to, you know, the built environment and the reality of becoming an architect, it threw up so many difficulties, but you almost had to change your mindset. It's like, okay, well, this is a lot more stringent than and that, not just me and a lot of my colleagues. So and another facet of that is actually getting, I would hope that they, number one, integrate with REBA a lot better, and within the education process, and help reform that a lot more to involve exactly what we were talking about in the first point. So how do you sort of integrate yourself within, you know, the early stages of community development or development as a whole in the construction? How do you integrate? Who are the key players in that, or who could be the key players? What's your role in there? How could you develop your role? It's just things like that, you know, just off the cuff that could be integrated into early education, just so, you know, architects have prospective architects have an idea of what they're going to be getting into in the real world. I think that's crucial, and I hope that's going to be part of their integration or their strategy, their overall strategy. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
That
I
makes
think
sense.
there's a hand raised. Rosie, you have your hand raised if you want to chime in.
Hello. Yeah. I can turn my video and just be friendly. Hello. So yeah, in sort of direct response to what Herman was just saying and highlighting about the role of the ARB, and especially in terms of architectural education, that's basically our opinion, and all of these really sort of insightful facts that are being brought up about sort of what needs to reform doesn't just sit with the ARB. That the reason why they're having so many consultations and surveys at the moment is because they've kind of been pressured to realize that the ARB as an organization doesn't know all of the answers. So they've created a situation where now all of us have the chance to have all of our voices heard. And so while we're sort of raising some really interesting points in this discussion, I just really urge everyone to actually, as an action, like take part in the survey and make sure that all of these sort of really interesting points get directed to the ARB, because they are asking for our input now. So I'll post the link in the chat, but yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that there is something that we can actively do in terms of that.
Thank you so much, Rosie. Zine, Sean, do you have any things to add?
Not really from me. I think, yeah, I think it's already been touched on, the what it is to be an architect now. I think it's quite fragile, because when I look at the industry as a whole, I quite honestly see a grab for all. And don't get me wrong, I think the profession is great, but especially when starting out as an architect, a lot of your kind of bread and butter starter jobs are extensions, smaller pieces of work. And I essentially see a lot more builders coming in for that type of work, interior designers, and there's nothing wrong with it really. There's no point really even crying about it, but like even when I was studying to be an architect, I did always question the value of the title, So I don't know. I think the ARB and the RIBA, they definitely need to up their game in a certain way. That's my opinion, to make it more valuable that you spend so long actually studying to be an architect, and what do you get in return? Like that's my main interest in the two. But I'll let Sean have something to say.
I think to kind of add to what everyone else has been saying, I think what is clearly needed is some kind of shake-up, because I think that AJ did a survey, and I think it was a couple of years back now, and the survey was saying that I believe it's less than 1% of the architects in the UK are Black. And I mean, I don't think they necessarily went into the other ethnic minorities, but I think that clearly shows that there's something wrong. And I think the survey also kind of alluded to the drop-off rate. So from part 1 to part 2, and then there being a steep drop-off rate from part 2 going towards getting your part 3 and qualifying as an architect. And I think there is some correlation there showing that maybe there's kind of this fatigue in the journey, or the architectural journey, and the kind of cost of the profession, and then coupled with the elitism of the profession and the kind of work that you're kind of doing. I think a lot of people by the end, or as they get towards the end, they feel as if maybe architecture isn't for them. Like, I think quite a lot of people go into architecture thinking that they're going to shape the world and make a massive difference. And I think that is possible. But I think when you've got at all angles, people kind of hitting you with different things, and it feels as if the world's kind of coming, falling under you. It almost feels as if like you can't do a lot of those things. And I think that's why we need to kind of see the ARB do some shaking up and reshuffling of the current kind of ways people are accredited. Because is there any other ways that people could become accredited? Is there other ways people could become architects? Because I think if we go back to what was mentioned about like these communities, how many people in some of these communities even know what an architect does? Do they even see themselves as an architect? Because I know when I was growing up, I didn't know what an architect was. I knew I wanted to be one, but I didn't actually know the ins and outs. So I do think there's also a job to be done there in terms of the kind of openness of architecture. And I think that's not exclusively the job of the ARB. Some of the onus can also be put on to the RIBA to kind of open the gates to architecture and make it more accessible. But I think without it being accessible, going back to my earlier point, we're gonna keep seeing these kind of low percentages of ethnic minorities being architects. And if we're going to be designing the city, we need everyone from every demographic of every kind of walk of life to be an architect, so we can really understand the voices of everyone.
Thank you, Sean. I mean, for me in particular, I mean, I don't have an architectural background. I'm just project manager, I'm former QS. But when I look at you guys and the studying that you've had to do for the whole of the amount of years that you've had to do it, I'm just like, that's crazy. And then when you actually do your actual role, say some of you drop off from part 2, some of you continue off going and doing your fancy stuff. But at the same time, it's like, how do you get the younger generation, the ones who are in schools, to really think about architecture as a profession and wanting to really be part of it? What's really happening with your professional bodies? What are they really doing? Are they backing you enough? Are they backing schools enough? Because I know for me, when I was in school, construction in itself wasn't even really talked about, especially to me as a young girl in my class, you know, into science. It was just, yeah, okay, we've got some trade apprenticeships, but that's not what you really want to be doing. You want to stay clear away from that. But then again, these professions exist. And why should we feel like we can't have it, or we can't have a seat at the table? It's not good enough to just have us there. We need to be able to eat from that table as well, chip in, be able to funnel that to the top, and likewise both ways. So yeah, I definitely am taking a lot from this discussion.
I think as well, I was just going to add quickly that, like, in addition to the topic of access, I think it's also like, I always think about if access was to be improved and people do get into the hub, then there's like the final barrier of like poor pay, which I think is something that people kind of not overlook. I mean, I think everyone's aware that architecture is a very poorly paid profession, but I think, you know, and I think a lot of like my friends, or I think people particularly from kind of ethnic minority backgrounds, we do tend to have a lot more responsibilities than our maybe like white counterparts in terms of, you know, supporting family or things like that. And I think those kinds of things, when you do get to that stage, that becomes the final sort of thing where you get in and you can't really afford to stay there because it just doesn't pay as well, because somebody else who might have more money than you or is able to afford to sort of continue and work all the late hours and do all the, you know, XYZ. And so ultimately you find that when you get to that point, you kind of want to leave. And I've had a lot of friends leave just off the back of that alone. So I think that's kind of another conversation. I think accessibility is one thing, but improving things that once you get to that point that the environment is actually favorable enough for you to stay and continue, I think that's a whole other conversation, because I think without that, it's like you can have it as accessible as we want, but then the retention just wouldn't stay, because I think, you know, unless you're wealthy or you have financial backing, just don't see how you could sustain a career in such a badly paid profession, personally. But
Thank you, Herman. You have your hand raised.
Yes, I think just to add to everybody else's comments, I also think this discussion has been going on for quite a long time, longer than, you know, I mean, when I graduated in, you know, this is like 2006 or so, we already knew that there were these percentages. And what's so sad, the percentages of architects and, you know, Black and ethnic minority architects within the profession was so low. But then it's almost like, you know, 15 years later plus, and it's the same problem. And sadly, when you actually go into the workplace, over that period of time, you actually see it play out. And as you get, you know, more experience in, especially in professional environments, you see, you know, maybe you do see a few different faces in certain practices. But what is more sad to me is when you go higher up in experience, you see a lot less and less and less. And that, to me, there needs to be some sort of program integrated where there are architects that are, you know, it's difficult to say not preferential treatment, but there is a way to sort of to fast track or to allow a route to get to that certain level where decisions are made and you have a level of responsibility without having to really, you know, fight. I mean, fight unusually hard and more hard than others would normally have to, especially when you know, if you've got a lot of experience and you've come from a lot of, you know, good companies. We've had it ourselves, and a lot of my colleagues. And you literally have to, you know, push and blast your way through to get anywhere. And I think if the ARB can help facilitate that with REBA as part of their overhaul, then it can't come soon enough, I think.
Thank you. And I think I just want to also add that I think another big barrier as well is actually the culture within architecture, especially in the education. You know, I can't talk about being in practice because I haven't been in practice, but I think the culture in universities, especially in the big ones such as the Bartlett or, you know, MIT, etc. There really is such a competition, dog eat dog kind of culture that does not, you know, it doesn't work for anyone because, you know, as we know, architecture is extremely traumatic to study, but also especially for people of color. and also working class, or people who aren't of upper class kind of financial social standing, is that it's a kind of you enter into an institution with its own set of codes and languages that you are expected to know before you even enter it, or kind of can read those codes before or as you enter. I wrote my whole thesis on this, and I think that's also incredibly important when it comes to retention, because when I was writing my thesis, it was also, as of last November, it was also still 1% of registered architects would class themselves as Black or Black British. So it's barely changed in 4 years. But and I think a big part of that is that the culture, it's so elitist, but it's also very much that the language that you're kind of expected to know and expected to translate, or you build a narrative and somehow translate that into a design or a spatial structure, that that sometimes isn't actually what's needed within for an architect to do. What might actually is needed is a sort of mediation type spatialization. It's not about just constructing narrative and making that into a building, or that, or having that role kind of prescribed onto you. It's actually trying to think about what is actually needed here in this site. What are people, what are the kind of, what is the local area, etc. All of these kind of questions, and it becomes kind of skewed when you're in such a kind of competitive institution, or one that is kind of based on aesthetics rather than sustainability, all of these kind of. And another thing exactly is value systems within these institutions. What is it that they value within architecture? Because if this is what you will pass and get this part 1 or part 2, then then clearly that's what architecture is supposed to be. But who sets out these criteria of, this is what architecture is, this is what we value? Yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents on the issue, I guess. And I don't know how the ARB is supposed to kind of change all of these things, because what we have spoken about is very vast and cultural. Some things aren't very concrete, they're much more abstract things. But yeah, I guess it's a step in the right direction, and filling in the survey that Rosie did send would be the start, I guess. Okay, so maybe we should go on to our third and final discussion point. So Eugene, can you share that screen? So our final point is Black and ethnic minority architects need to be more active in disrupting the status quo and think more creatively about how they can reshape the profession. So Zine, we're going to start with you this time. Over to you. Thanks, Eugene. You can stop sharing.
Yeah, so my take on this is so Black people need to be more disruptive. For me, I'd say that Black people, or everyone to be honest, needs to be more authentic. I think that's the key word that I've begun to really focus on my journey. Because take a architecture student, first year into architecture, sooner or later along that journey to becoming an architect, they're going to be programmed subconsciously or consciously to work in specific practices, because they're told that, oh, this practice, I'm not going to say any names, but certain practices that we all know are the best practices to work at. And essentially, we're already in a spiral there, because this whole conversation that we're having now is based on essentially elitists or higher ups controlling the way that we're living or doing architecture. But from that early stage where we're kind of taught to aspire to work at certain practices. So why I take that back to authenticity is because what I try and encourage all students to do is actually ask yourself, like, who are you and what do you want to represent? What are your problems? Because the majority of us as students, our options are quite little as soon as we come out of university in terms of what architecture we can actually afford. And what I find so many students doing is aspiring to design basically housing or projects which they can't actually afford themselves. So what I found myself do when I started my own practice was trying to be authentic. So what I realized when I started my practice was I don't have much money. I'm gonna have to live back at my parents and I'm gonna have to try and make this work. And my first project was building a little studio on an allotment. And that allotment cost me £50 a year to rent. Now that's affordability to me, especially when you're a student. And of course, that's quite an embarrassing story in the world of architecture. Like, I know to your average Joe, they might be like, okay, whatever. But you know, in our profession, you want your first project to be this multi-development architecture or, you know, a high-end villa somewhere, but you don't actually think, actually, how am I going to solve my current problem? So I think what we can all do as kind of architects or designers in the industry is actually be authentic and say, what is my story? It might not get me kind of front page on the AJ magazine or Dezeen, but it might actually inspire others to be authentic too. And I think that's really the key. That's kind of my 2 cents on the conversation.
Thank you so much. Sean, would you like to chime in as well?
Yeah, I think quite a lot of ethnic minorities are currently challenging the status quo. I think definitely in London anyway, we're definitely seeing this kind of resurgence of the collective. So I know during the kind of financial crash, a lot of collective kind of emerged off the back of architects not necessarily being able to get jobs or architects being made redundant. But now we're seeing collectives in a completely different context. We're seeing collectives emerge because young designers, young built environment practitioners see the need and the urgency to start to challenge some of the existing systems in architecture. And we're seeing this whether it's through the form of writing in the work that After Party does, or through the kind of community orientated work that Resolve Collective does, or even through the work that my collective Poor does with young people. I think we are seeing a lot of kind of emerging designers opt to start out with or set up their own organization as opposed to being a slave to a massive machine and simply being a cog or a foot soldier. I mean, I think this is something that Zine alluded to. A lot of people, instead of kind of just going to the big practices that everyone kind of really bigs up, they're trying to do their own thing. And I think there's a lot of power in that, because we're seeing works that we wouldn't necessarily see. We're seeing opportunities emerge that we wouldn't necessarily see, and we're kind of being inspired. I think it's inspiring to see people set up their own organizations, their own businesses, their own collectives, and I think that's really going to be something that's going to shake up architecture. And I think what we're also seeing is, by people having their own organization, their own companies, they're really making these big organizations accountable, because they're not working for a practice, and that practice is dictating what they can say and what they can do. With many people working for themselves, they're now feeling more courageous, and when they're looking at their peers and they're kind of and people that are in similar positions, they're now feeling as if they've got the power to stand up, do things, say things, and also have agency. And I think that's something that's incredibly important. So I would say we are seeing the status quo being challenged. And as a result of this, that's why these big organizations need to kind of wake up, because they're seeing that the kind of emerging talent are doing great things. And if they don't keep up, this kind of emerging talent at some point will kind of consume their organizations, whether it's 10, 20 or 50 years time.
Thank you, Sean. That was actually really, really profound what you said, just off the back of what yourself and Zine have said. I mean, yeah, we definitely have to shake the tables, and things are changing. At the end of the day, we are the emerging talent, we are the next gen. We're only going to get fed up if we just continue being in this same cycle of, okay, we're getting qualified here, we're here, but we can't really do and build what we really want to build. You know, our communities, our people are compromised. What are we really doing for that? Especially living in a big capital as London, it just makes you think, really, like, is this really what I wanted to do when I set out to become an architect, to become a project manager, to become a quantity surveyor? You know, all of these things, we have to get to a point where we're like, you know what, go it alone. And so I'm totally here for people having their own practices, starting up their own startups, and really just showing everybody, look, you know, we've got this housing crisis that we've been banging on about for how long now, but we're doing our own things. You know, it's relatable for me to know that Zine is designing and shaping for things that I can do and fit in my garden. You know, that is more prevalent to me than big, massive tower blocks that don't really say anything to me, and let alone I can't afford. So that is definitely key.
Thanks, Shanesia. And I see Herman, you have your hand raised there.
Yeah, hi. No, I'm really heartened by what Zine and Sean and Shanisa have just said, because I think that's very, especially trying to push forward your, I guess, ideals within your own means and entrepreneurship, I think is absolutely crucial for architects. And minority architects, Black architects and minority architects, because I feel we get this idea, this is going back to this idea of the modern built environment and what we think it is and what we've been educated to think it is. And you almost sometimes, especially if you're educated in Europe, to sort of decode that or use the elements that you've learned to develop architecture. You almost have to decode it and then re-educate yourself and integrate it within your own self, like Azim was saying, in your own, I guess, with your own view of your own culture and how that influences. Because at the end of the day, that's what it ends up being. Every architect, they have a background and they will input their background into that. And the one of the people I can think of that is actually doing that is on a larger scale, obviously, is David Adjaye currently, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, early in my career I fought tooth and nail to actually learn how he was doing it. Yes, after going to practices, etc., and large practices, when you try and start your own practice, as Sean said, you kind of brought to earth with a bump. You try to be an entrepreneur. You're like, right, I'm going to do exactly what the big boys are doing, and you brought to earth with a bump. Like, okay, I've got to do this extension because I've got to actually. But then, if you cultivate your own ethos within your own means, and you have a good philosophy, which needs to be cultivated over time. I think coupled with entrepreneurship, I think there's a lot of that can be gained from disrupting the status quo. I just think it takes a long time. It's not a slow process, but there's perseverance involved in that, and you know, it will come good.
Thanks, Herman. I just also want to say to the audience, you guys can also chime in as well. This is a very open discussion. And I guess what I kind of wanted to add to, these amazing points as well is that that I think, I definitely agree with Sean in that people are, Black and ethnic minority architects, urban planners, designers are stepping up and disrupting the status quo. Um, but I would say, coming now living in Sweden, is that there's a completely different context here and a completely different kind of potentiality here, because I think one of the good things about London and England in general is that I think we're quite mature when we talk about race, when we talk about ethnicity. I mean, we still got far to go, but in Sweden, they don't talk about race at all. Racism is kind of being not racist rather than, having mature conversations about race and dealing with things such as systemic racism, etc. And there's a sort of new kind of potential here in terms of how diverse we can make architecture here in a sort of very different way that I think London kind of has its grips on already. Because I think, collectives such as like Resolve Collective and, have those kind of collectives where it really is about designing for people on the ground, or having sort of projects that are affordable, like your project Zine, or a few of my friends' projects. She did for her master's thesis, she did a garden in her local estate. I think those kind of projects are, diverse, small projects aren't really here in Sweden the way that it is in London, or that you can have that kind of potential. So I guess this kind of my point that I'm making really is that we also do need to celebrate that we have this in London, because it's not everywhere, especially in the rest of Europe as well. Lemma, I see that your hand is raised. Do chime in.
Hi, Tyler. Yes, just obviously because you'd invited contributions, I thought I'd say hello. It's been brilliant, guys. I really enjoyed things people had to say, and some of the points have been. I'd actually like to kind of just join the dots between a few of the things that people have said as well, because I think, see, when you were talking about the idea that a lot of our work in our profession, the talk between yourself and Marwa about adjacencies and thinking between the lines, I think is something really powerful. And the idea that actually we're sitting here waiting for people to steal our jobs and steal the things that we do, I think people should be worried about us stealing their jobs, and actually we should be thinking, how do we make builders terrified of us? I mean, in a bit of a weird way. I think that's a bit silly, but I think people thinking creatively about how they triangulate between different professions is something that will make us stronger. And I think part of it is to do with the architecture education in its nature, because you spent 7 years, or what have you, putting yourself into a strange box, and a box that doesn't fit everyone. You don't necessarily want to jump out of it too quickly, but I think it can be done. And I think it's the same as the stuff that kind of Sean's been talking about in terms of the collective approach. And it brings me on to a point about markets and access. And I think it also chimes with the point about thinking about who you could read your point, Zine, about changing your approach or sizing your approach suitable to your opportunities. But in a way, I think that is empowering. And I think also that, there are certain things that make me quite angry about the way that people have let certain aspects of the built environment culture take opportunities that should have belonged to them. So the thing that I'm thinking about is the almost Stirling Prize winning mosque that was designed by, I'm sure they're very sensitive, and I saw they did a very good job. The Marks Barfield Mosque, 40% of London is BAME or POC or whatever label you want to put it. I don't care. I some people get offended by that, but what I mean, what I mean. I don't know what the right term is because I can't keep up. But the principle that there's that big a market of people that don't even think that architecture is for them, and perhaps that's just because people are sizing their product too big. Like people can't afford the things that architects offer because architects aren't thinking creative enough about how to get that product to people. But the person that can do that and get to those communities, I think is going to be someone really strong. And I think we can think about these things and we can build up from that smaller basis. But I think I heard a lot of interesting things the way you guys are talking. It's inspired me to, at least say that point, I think, overall. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Thanks a million for that. I'm not sure if you can hear me. That was spot on. Agree with you completely.
Thank you, Lemma. Thank you, Zine. Thanks, everyone. We've got a few hand raised. So Femi, over to you.
Hello, good evening, and I apologize for being late. I was held up in another one, but it's interesting because when I've listened to you, it reminds me of when I first qualified in the depths of the last recession, where I had a bit of a gung-ho attitude of, just trying to get work. Whether it was a toilet extension, whether it was a small little thing, and then trying to build up one's reputation by doing the little things really well and then getting the opportunity. I think today, with the advent of social media, where you're able to promote without actually spending a lot of money, I think, the next gen really have to use that, because as I sit now trying to think of ways of becoming more relevant, especially being part of a large organization. All large organizations are having to demonstrate what they're doing for the young starters. Whether it doesn't matter what color you are, it would help if you were, dare I say, from a non-traditional background, because it does mean when you're bidding and they're assessing, one is able to demonstrate that you are reaching out beyond your sphere of the fact that, little Tarkin with the trust fund whose parents are going to give them a project, so you've just got to use whatever you have to promote yourselves and just be aggressive. There's no point. I was listening to someone the other day who said, the difference between those that really make it and those that want to make it is having guts. You just got to go out there and just say, you know what, I am who I am. I've done my study and now I'm going to go and make it. And someone will give you that opportunity at some point. So, especially with frameworks now, as the new frameworks that are coming out, there are places for micro firms, which, I've been working really hard on, because when I sit on panels, to allow spaces for just starting firms. Yes, the last time it went slightly awry because those that got through, there weren't many that were from non-traditional backgrounds, so they had to recast it. Such was the uproar. But then when it gets recast, you young professionals have to go out there and say, okay, let me put my hat in the ring. You got to be, this, when one travels the world, London or the UK is still one of the places where a young person, a young firm can still make some headway. So much more difficult in other countries. So use the opportunities.
Do you think, Femi, also that often in cases where these frameworks get firms of the micro scale, I guess, but even, they need to be in a position where they're not just facilitating access for traditional background firms to get access to places where they're not actually welcome, and quite often that is the case. And I think it's about,
and we're changing that. I mean, so when I say we, those who are setting these frameworks, because the likes of myself and say Annette get to sit on these panels, we're actually pushing that. And it may not seem it's happening quickly enough, but it is happening. So much so that, the Mayor of London is saying, unless you're able to demonstrate how you, Mr. Big Firm or Mrs. Big Firm, are interacting with the smaller micro firms from people like yourselves or on this call, you will not get on the framework. As always, as we've noticed over the last few months, years, when it starts hitting the pocket financially, that's what brings change. That's what really, in a way, upsets the status quo. When firms are starting to realize that they could actually be losing the little bit that, whether or not they lose 10%, 50%, 80%, if they're going to lose work because they're not reaching out to you know, you youngsters, I'm sorry, I'm 55, I can use that word, please forgive me, I've got the gray hair. You know, you've got to, you just got to, yeah, you just got to be brave and just go for it. And the great thing is at your age, unless you're establishing you've got a mortgage, what do you really have to lose? That's what I had. I remember when I started, I had nothing to lose. So I just went, I was gung ho. I basically was just I was delivering. I was saying I could deliver. I was getting mates in to help me do projects. We were getting it done. You know, it was, yeah. Sean's laughing because you can understand. Hustler. It was a hustler business.
You can't see me, but I'm laughing also, Femi. Just to add to that, I think there's also a space for where you venture into entrepreneurship, and a route that we also went down was very, very similar to Jean's story, because we also decided, well, why can't we're looking at lots of developers developing, using us, creating a lot of wealth, and not really, and whittling down our ideas. Why don't we try and do something like that? And we've started small, and you make deals with people that have land, and suddenly you're at the table where you can actually influence the impact of your, you know, the outcome. You can start small, and this is where we're at. You can start small, you start from somewhere, and you start building up, and you can, you know, you become that person that's at the table. We're doing that at the Caribbean at the moment. We saw some land and said, well, what can we do? This is my culture. I know what I'm doing. And we push, and then you get somewhere. You do end up getting, you know, and you can diversify in that way as well. Being an architect and developer, personally, we feel like this is possibly one of the ways to go as disrupting the status quo as well. Developing is a massive string to our bow that we already integrate with and work with developers constantly. But you know, we seem to be slightly trepidatious when it comes to doing it ourselves when we actually can. So, and I know a few guys in West Africa that are doing exactly the same thing. So, you know,
and another way of maybe striking the deal is being quite innovative in how you do it. I mean, it's not new, but you know, what I used to do when I was much younger, I used to say, okay, you know, my fee is going to be this, but I want a percentage at the end. So therefore, I've got skin in the game. Okay, right. And if it's a developer client, a developer will say, well, what have I got to lose? If we make money, we all make money. If you lose, I'm not paying the architect anyway. You know. So therefore, if you've got skin in the game and you're working towards it, that's just another way of trying to leverage the fact that there isn't hundreds of thousands of pounds in the bank.
That's right. I can't underestimate exactly what Femi has just said. I cannot overestimate that. That is a very, very strong point that he's just made there. It's very, very important, because I think there's a lot of possibility in that, in disrupting the status quo as we discussed.
Okay, thank you. And I see that Sarah has her hand raised. You're muted.
Indeed got my hand. I have indeed got my hand raised. Thank you. I'm in fact, Tyler has not mentioned, but you can see we probably got the same surname here. So, so my career has been in public sector regeneration. I currently I'm chief executive of Spurs' charity, and architect's been at my heart for many, many years. In fact, I gave David Ajay some of the first commissions. But I just wanted to say, so when I joined the call, Shanasia, you were talking about housing associations, and I've just completed a 9-year stint as a chair of a housing association in North East London, 8,000 homes, and very diverse board. And I must say, as part of that was through me emphasising that. But one thing I'd advise all of you to do, if you get the opportunity to do it, and in fact take the opportunity to do it, try and do it, is actually join a housing association board, even if it's first of all as a co-optee and as a developing housing association. Most housing associations will develop, push yourself to be in a position where you're on the development committee. And this is not necessarily hard to do. You will have to go through a competitive process, but you guys, you've got a compelling offer, okay? Yeah. And in doing that, what you'll do is you'll learn from the commissioner's side, you'll make networks, and that is crucially important. Whether you're going to have your own business, whatever you want to do, the more networks you have, the more relationships you have, the more you've got the opportunity to show what you do, to learn at that same time, and then to bring your own self to that, be your authentic self, the more that will help you. And you are then at the decision-making table, and people will want you. People yearn to have Black people around the table, particularly young. Too many of the boards are silver-haired, elderly, and they need the young because the communities they're serving are the young people. And the other issue is, and this is you spoke about, and I was looking at the ARB's work and what they're doing, and they're trying to reform, based on my interpretation of reading that strategy, they're trying to reform on the basis of, it's not about your journey to becoming qualified. What do you expect a newly qualified architect to be able to do? And again, within that, and I remember when I was going with Tyler to look at universities, you've got your engineering type architects and your creatives. And I find architecture quite interesting because if you're a creative, you're often being constrained with your creativity because of the disciplines you have to do in architecture. If you get involved in things which are to do with your community, if you get involved in things, whether it's through the housing association or through the public sector, and I've commissioned lots of architecture through the public sector, allow your creativity to come through and be assertive, express yourself and make sure people listen to you. Because otherwise it's very easy. I've interviewed lots of companies where we say we want diversity and they'll bring people along, but actually they're bringing them along. It's a sort of a bit of a showcasing, look, we've got diversity. When I then look at how are they contributing to that development of that build or that placemaking that they're doing, they're actually not. It's being dominated again by, not by BAME people. And so I think it's really important. Try and get around the table. Housing association is a good way in to get around the table, get on the board, get into decision making, and be assertive. And whilst you're doing that, I think also what you'll do is you'll learn a lot yourself, but you'll be able to give a lot, and particularly to your communities that you come from. Okay, thank you. And you're doing this fantastic, actually. It's really great listening to you.
Could I quickly say something very quickly? It's funny you say that because there's a particular housing association, I'm not going to name them, but they have been in the press quite a lot recently. And it's quite interesting, the person that is speaking about the housing association, because that person is very similar to each of us. He is also a young person. And it's funny that, like, when he's speaking about, and I'm sure you guys can hint at the housing association begins with a C, but when you kind of see someone speaking about the housing association from a resident's kind of perspective, ethnic minority perspective, it seems like there is this kind of out of sync, so something quite out of sync, and I do wonder if we do really want change, we do need to be sitting on these boards to enact change before it has to kind of, it goes so far that you have to kind of speak to the press to try and shine some light on many of the issues.
Yeah, Sean, it's a fantastic point you make, and being on a housing association, actually, it's really, really hard because the majority of your customers of a housing association because they can't afford to purchase on the market. And whether that's through a rented accommodation, so they've got very, very low disposable income, or if you're buying shared ownership within that context. And the other aspect is the majority of your work as a housing association is controlled by government. So what you can actually invest in, actually the things that you'd want a great landlord to do, is sometimes very hard. However, they're complex things that you'll have to deal with on the board. But I think the other thing that you'll be able to is the growth and is that development, whether it's infill sites, which are fantastic, or whether it's brand new developments, and that placemaking bit. And what I find too often, people just think about the structure and they don't think about the people who are going to live in that structure and how those unintended uses of places. So it's very difficult, but you're coming across real issues. You know, and it is very hard whether you're, and increasingly actually, your housing association, if you live in them, they should be inviting tenants to be genuine participants on the board. But it's a great way to see the world from another perspective and lens, but also I think help with your professional development as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Tyler. Sarah, your words are beautiful. They were so wise, and literally, Tyler's so fortunate to have you. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We definitely need to get our places in those boards, 100%.
I can help you if you need to. I can give you some guidance about how to go about it, and you can organise it through Tyler, and really try and target and get some applications in and get on them.
100%. I will definitely send my email to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So Annette, we see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Sarah, for chipping in there. That's absolutely fantastic, and that's the kind of encouragement I think that, you know, the young people that are on this panel and who have set this event up really need, because all of it really begins with the confidence, the self-belief that yes, I can do that, and I can be on that board, and I can be a representative. I can be a representative as an architect, as a member of our society. I can be a shape maker, and that's what this is really all about, to empower, inspire, and, you know, give you guys serious oomph, shall we say, the sort of gumption to go out there and just do it, because it's in the doing that we learn, it's in the doing that we achieve. And that really is the only way that it all starts to, we can start to unravel. And I think one of the points that I really enjoyed, but has been discussed tonight, is about the fact of how, you know, we can make the environment scared of us taking those jobs rather than the other way around. And Sarah's comment about getting involved and getting into those positions to be decision makers is about that. It's about the making it happen. So I just wanted to chip in and just to congratulate you all for a really fantastic debate here. I mean, it's been brilliant to hear your points of view and how you are perceiving this industry and how it affects you directly. And I just want to say, you know, more grease to your elbow, and I'm going to leave it at there for Shanizia and Tyler to round it off.
Thank you, Shanizia. Do you want to?
Yes, so this has been a very brilliant discussion. I have wholeheartedly enjoyed it, listening to every single one of the speakers and listening to your journeys, especially within architecture. So that's something that I didn't do. You know, I just did my degree, normal biology degree, then did a couple of years of work experience, and then did my master's in construction management economics. So hearing your journeys, 7 years, Tyler, you're still at it, you're still doing that. You guys, you really do. I am really in awe of all of you. And whenever I work with anybody, especially on my projects, I always take what architects say for full value, because at the end of the day, you guys really do know your stuff. You've had to spend how many years doing it. But again, with the built environment and the culture and the changes, and how do we fit in, and how do we get the next generation in from schools, these conversations need to carry on. We need to be unapologetic in our speech. We need to continue speaking. And this event, along with Let's Build Anyway, we're having these discussions. So please continue to watch our social media. We're going to continue putting our videos up, our posts up, and some interesting stuff as well. So thank you everybody for coming to today's discussion. And Tyler.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add much to that. I think this conversation has been incredibly inspiring, incredibly hopeful for me as someone who is still on my journey within architecture and beyond. again, I know we were talking before, and it's always nice, like I said, it's always hopeful for me to know that there are other avenues other than working in a big practice and selling your soul to the devil. You know, I'd like to, you know, it's not, and you know, it's always empowering to see when it's done by Black people and people of color who look like me, who have thoughts like me, and, you know, who have, you know, put their stamp on a system that wasn't designed and built for us, because unfortunately that's how it is. And so, yes, I think this has been incredible, and it's really nice that we've had such deep and amazing conversations, and I wish it could continue, because I love having these kind of conversations for ages. But yes, thank you all for coming, and, you know, check out our social media and all of that at Let's Build. We're on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and I also want to thank our committee, you know, and Elizabeth, who is not here with us, and Francetta, who is here, as well as our amazing speakers, and Eugene as well for being amazing. Yes, but I think all of our speakers as well deserve a massive virtual round of applause. And yes, thank you so much.